Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. I am Wellesley President Paula Johnson, and again, thank you for joining us tonight for this virtual discussion examining the impact of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Earlier this week, I was proud to join with presidents of Barnard, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Smith, and Vassar to author a letter to the editor that was published in the New York Times. I'd like to read an excerpt from that statement because I think it helps to establish the context for the conversation we are going to have this evening. And I quote, "Even as we reaffirm our commitment to respecting individual differences in beliefs and values, as presidents of colleges that were founded for women, we are deeply concerned about the effect of this ruling that it will have on women's lives and the lives of people of all genders who will be denied or will have limited access to reproductive health care. History and research suggest that this ruling will have a negative influence on college access, graduation rates, and employment trajectories, and that people of color and those with limited incomes will most negatively be affected. It goes without saying that this is a critical moment for our community and our country. As a mother of a daughter and as Wellesley's president, I can't tell you how much it pains me to realize that many of our students will be denied a right that their mothers and grandmothers had. That is why, in addition to speaking out on the national level, as a college, we are also focused on what we can do in the immediate future to help our students living in states where reproductive health care is being constrained. We are currently working to better understand where there will be limitations on health insurance, the legalities of providing medical abortion across state lines, and how we can support our students who may need to travel to Massachusetts if they are residing in states where abortion is severely restricted or unavailable. I'm so grateful to Professor Jennifer Musto for moderating this important panel and to our extraordinary panelists who are here with us tonight. Jennifer Musto is an associate professor of women and gender studies at Wellesley College, where she teaches courses on gender, sexuality, and race, among other topics. She is also the incoming director of the Knapp Social Sciences Center and an external fellow affiliated with the University of Rochester's Center for the Humanities. I truly look forward to the conversation, which I know will be the first of many that we organize on this topic, and turn it over to Professor Musto to introduce our panelists, who I am proud to say are all alumni of the college and bring vital and informative perspectives to this critical topic. Over to you, Professor Musto.
Thank you so much, President Johnson, both for the opportunity to moderate this panel and to be in conversation with Wellesley alums on the panel and all of you who have joined us this evening. Last Friday, the Supreme Court in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization overturned Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, a ruling that stated that abortion is not a fundamental right under the Constitution. That decision, though widely anticipated, has nonetheless been shocking. And over the past few days, its broad scope and devastating impact has come into sharper focus. The court's decision has also led to an outpouring of grief, anger, rage, and anxiety, both in anticipation of the legal chaos and profound suffering already and likely to continue to be wrought in its wake. I would imagine that in between absorbing all of the media dispatches, reporting on the impending restrictions, for instance, through trigger bans, have also been absorbed alongside the sharing of stories, connecting with friends, community, and family members to make sense of it all. And this is where I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge all of you who are here. I want to note that your experiences, your feelings have a place here, even if those experiences and feelings may not all be shared. In other words, that there are a lot of complexities that surround the topic. But it's in the wake of this devastating decision that I am very glad to be in conversation with various Wellesley alums, each of whom has dedicated their professional lives and advocacy to ensuring for the protection of reproductive health care, and also thinking more broadly about what a more socially justice future needs to include. The aim of today's webinar is really to discuss the most immediate effects, that is the range of legal, policy, and health implications that come directly out of this ruling. And let me just say here a few notes of perhaps that are obvious, but in my opinion, bear noting. One webinar cannot hold the vast implications of this decision. I also think it's crucial to acknowledge that how we talk about this topic, for instance, the language used, the experiences that are surfaced or that are invisible, also matter and really demand our collective attention. It's my hope, and here I'm speaking directly for myself, that this is the first of many conversations, including conversations led by students, current and former, faculty, staff, and all members of the Wellesley community to continue to think about the implications of this. So again, this is the first of what I hope will be many future conversations. So in terms of logistics, the roadmap is as follows. For the first 30 minutes, we are going to have a moderated discussion about the health advocacy and health advocacy and legal ramifications of this decision. And there are some targeted questions for our featured speakers. We also are going to bring in as many of the questions from folks who are joining us today. So you're welcome to put those questions in the chat. We will bring in as many as possible at about the 30-minute mark. So you don't need to wait, you can post those, but we will not bring those in until after we've asked a few questions to get us started. So I'm thrilled to introduce this panel, and I'm going to introduce the panelists in order in which we'll have that first section of a moderated discussion. Starting first with Professor Carol Sanger, class of 1970. Professor Sanger is a professor of law at Columbia Law School and an award-winning teacher and influential scholar of reproductive rights. Also joining us to discuss the legal implications are Jennifer Chou, class of 2008, a staff attorney within the Gender, Sexuality, and Reproductive Justice Program at the ACLU of Northern California. Alise Powell, class of 2015, joins us too. Alise is Senior Policy Analyst at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, a collaborative that creates solutions to optimize Black maternal and infant health through training, policy, advocacy, research, and community-centered collaboration. Ann Warner, class of 2000, joins us too as Chief Executive Officer of the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization based in South Carolina. Veronica Ades, class of 1999, joins us as well. Veronica is the director of the Empower Center and an OBGYN with vast experiences working in clinical settings in the United States, as well as in the global health space too, including in places where abortion is illegal. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Devika Maulik, class of 2000, is a maternal fetal medicine specialist and associate professor of obstetrics and gynecology at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and University Health. It's a fabulous lineup. I'm very grateful to everyone for joining us. And with that, we're going to transition now to looking specifically at the legal implications. And so I want to invite Carol and Jennifer to join us. And I want to start with Carol in your capacity as an expert on constitutional law in giving us a broad, and I know this is a very challenging ask, but a broad, but perhaps as nuanced of an overview in the time that you have to kind of understand and help us untangle the ramifications of this decision. Thank you so much, Carol.
Surely. I thought that I thought I would start though with talking about privacy, because lots of the ramifications come from the fact that privacy was the basis, the theoretical basis that sustained Roe in the first place. And we've had many cases prior to Roe that used privacy, but in the context of abortion, it drew particular opposition. And the notion of privacy is simply that there are parts of the Constitution where if you look at what they're really about protecting people from the government so that the government doesn't get in your way in living your private life. Most of the decisions involve intimacy, families, and childbearing. And so we had decisions on contraception, for example, and then on abortion. Now, the problem with the immediate ramification of using privacy was that it made made Roe seem weak to anti-abortion people. And they said, this isn't law. The word privacy isn't even in the Constitution. This is just made up. And there was opposition from the very beginning. And other theories were, over time, thought to be useful too. So in Casey, the second important case, liberty came in, and that is in the Constitution. And some people have argued, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that sex equality would have been a better basis for grounding Roe, the different treatment of men and women when it comes to their parenting. But it was privacy. So privacy has implications. We have Roe, and now we had Roe, and now we don't have Roe. And so I want to look at a second aspect of the implications of privacy, which is that if you knock privacy down and erase it from jurisprudence as a doctrine that is as a valid doctrine, it means that if there are other cases that are also grounded in privacy, you can try to knock them down too, because you've wiped them out with regard to abortion. Now, in his opinion, Justice Alito said, and don't be worried, this only has to do with abortion and we're not after any other rights. But he forgot to talk to his colleague, Justice Clarence Thomas, who said something along the lines of, bring it on. We want it. This is a great opportunity for us to take, for people to attack contraceptive use, same-sex sexual intimacy, and same-sex marriage. Those were the three that he pointed at. So those are, I believe, very likely in the coming years to be attacked on the same grounds that Roe was. And so that's like I'm just hope you feel somewhat oriented in privacy right now. Do you want me to go on to any of the other ramifications, or am I out of time?
I think let's go for the other ramifications in the next minute or so. Yeah, please. A little longer is fine.
Okay. Well, the question was, what are the ramifications for women, and what are the ramifications for states themselves, women in illegal states? And I wanted to say that the ramifications for women are so painful. Women are going to be more stressed, sadder, less healthy, and it's the deprivation not only of a right, but of the service that the right represents. And they're also likely to be more ashamed, because now if a woman has an abortion in a legal state or elsewhere, she won't be having an abortion, she'll be committing a crime. And so she moves from being a patient to being a criminal. And I think you have to take that on. Women already under Roe, where abortion was supposedly legal, felt shameful. They didn't talk about abortions. Many women don't talk about it at all, or for decades. And I think this is quite a serious social problem, because the less abortion is actually talked about, the more the narrative defaults to the anti-abortion advocates, who get to tell you who has abortions and what they're like and why they did it, which is not the full story at all. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. And I want to lean into this question about criminalization, and I think this is something, Jennifer, you can help us to sort through based on your own experiences, but also the framework in terms of the language, right? Because I think certainly cisgender women are and cisgender girls are implicated, but pitching further to think about the broader gendered effects for trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. Criminalization seems like it's a very real reality for a number of people under this decision. So Jennifer, maybe starting us off with the criminalization dimension. You've had some direct experiences with work, so maybe you could just map out what some of the key insights that folks that might not do your direct work may not know about how pregnancy among people can be criminalized and what you may anticipate in the future.
Thank you. I think Professor Sanger is absolutely right. You know, we are not returning to 1973. We are in a brand new world. Before Roe was handed down or decided, the threat was primarily to providers of care or pregnant people who were only left with options to seek unsafe abortions. And in fact, today, we actually have safe and effective means and accessible ways for people to self-manage their own pregnancy. So instead, what we are seeing today is a shift towards criminalizing pregnant people themselves. One of our colleagues at the National Advocates for Pregnant Women did an extensive study that documented that between 2006 and 2020, the number of cases of pregnancy criminalization tripled compared to what they were documenting between 1973 when Roe was decided and 2005. And that it includes cases that I worked on in California, that of Adora Perez and Chelsea Becker. I think it's really important to acknowledge that the Supreme Court decision was a mass criminalization event, both of providers and for pregnant people. And I also think it's important to acknowledge the fact that what we're seeing in terms of the trends is the reality that this is not just going to stop at abortion. This is going to impact all decision-making as it relates to pregnancy, all the way down to whether you had a glass of wine with your pregnancy, if you got prenatal care, if you are taking medications or seeking other medical care or treatment that has potential interactions with your pregnancy, like are you taking medication for depression? Are you seeking treatment for cancer? You know, this is the world that we now live in. And as Professor Musto indicated, you know, there's also more happening here around the way that the law is now treating bodily autonomy. We only have to look as far as the wave of anti-trans legislation that we are seeing across the states. This is all one and the same argument. The questioning of people's decisions to make decisions, ability to make decisions about their bodies, and the use of the law as a cudgel to enforce other people's decisions and to replace their decision-making with yours.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think what I'm also hearing in the latter part of your note, Jennifer, are the kind of ways in which these topics are implicated and interwoven into so many other issues, including but not limited to reproductive justice at the intersection of racial justice, struggles for gender equity, sexual justice, and disability justice. So maybe briefly, as a way for us to kind of then segue into advocacy, how does a reproductive justice lens shape how you're approaching your legal advocacy?
Absolutely. We know that even when Roe was the law of the land, it was not a guarantee to access to abortion care. For example, I know that a lot of folks think about California as a bastion of progressive laws, but in California, only 40% of our counties have an abortion care provider. I, at the ACLU of Northern California, worked for over 5 years in our office in Fresno in the Central Valley, which is actually a very conservative part of the state. And even abortion providers there, many of them flew in from more progressive areas like the Bay Area. So even in states like California, we really struggled with ensuring all of our citizens or all of our residents had access to care, even though we have among the most progressive laws in the country. Laws that codify a right are only as meaningful as people's ability to actually access that right. And people don't have the ability to access their right if they are afraid of being discriminated against at the doctor's office, if they don't have access to adequate translation services, if they don't have an income, or if they don't have a job that allows them to take time off or to arrange for child or dependent care, if they can't get to the doctor's office because they don't have an accessible means of transportation. For example, even in California, it took over 2 hours for someone to drive, for example, from Siskiyou County or from Tulare County to somebody who, to a doctor in Fresno, because that is their closest abortion provider. Accessing abortion requires us to navigate the most intimate, private parts of our lives through very public and intersecting systems. And that is why, at least for those of us who are doing this work, we do our work from the perspective and using the reproductive justice framework, which is a framework and a concept that was developed in the 90s by Black women to acknowledge the fact that the conversation that we have to be having has to be more expansive than just your right to abortion. It has to be broadly about the ability to determine if, when, and how to have children, how to parent the children we have in safety and dignity, and looking beyond just a conversation about your rights, but what it means to actually effectuate your rights and access your rights for all people.
Jennifer, thank you so much. And I think that's a brilliant and wonderful segue for us to transition now to bringing in Alise into the conversation, as well as Anne, to talk about the kind of advocacy implications of laws, the limits of laws, and also thinking about this framing around intersectional vulnerabilities, as well as a reproductive justice lens. So Alise, you work at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, and I know that through your work, there have been some focused discussions and arguments related to the Dobbs case. So I thought, since we started there at the front of our discussion, maybe you could flesh out some of the components of the argument within that brief, and maybe tell us a little bit more about how your organization has been organizing in anticipation or in the wake of this decision.
Absolutely. So NBEC was fortunate enough to have been able to lead a birth equity amicus brief, which was the first of its kind in an abortion case, with the great help of a pro bono team at Covington. And so for context, an amicus brief is a tool that advocates use to offer insight, expertise, or information that has bearing on the issues in a particular case. So NBEC, along with some of the leading maternal health scholars and advocates in our field, signed on to a brief that we submitted that really tied together the implications of this case for pregnant, capable people in Mississippi and across the globe. And so when we filed back in September, we knew that the stakes were incredibly high, and as abortion care is critical for an individual's ability to participate equally in society and determine the course of their lives. So some of the things that our brief highlighted were how detrimental the impact that abortion restrictions have on people with the capacity for pregnancy, particularly on the most vulnerable members of our community, including Black, Indigenous, people of color, those with disabilities, those with limited means, and LGBTQ+ individuals. And some of those arguments included the fact that Mississippi has one of the worst maternal mortality rates in the country. It also has one of the highest child poverty rates in the country, and has also chosen not to extend Medicaid postpartum coverage from 60 days to 12 months. And along with several other instances where Mississippi and the state infrastructure are failing to meet the needs and the baseline social determinants of health of its residents. And so at its heart, the Dobbs case kind of presented an issue of fundamental human rights. and the autonomy that pregnant persons have to make their own decisions and whether or not to continue a pregnancy. And so we made the case that pregnant people themselves, not the state, are in the best position to weigh the risks of proceeding with a pregnancy and make the best decision about reproductive care for their individual circumstances. We also highlighted the fact that the maternal health crisis we're experiencing in this country disproportionately affects Black women and birthing people who are more likely to experience adverse maternal health outcomes than any other group, both in Mississippi and across the United States more generally. And these disparate outcomes reflect a lengthy history of policies and practices that have affected Black communities, reducing their access to quality healthcare, education, jobs, and other resources. And so in effect, Mississippi's ban and the subsequent reversal of Roe is an exercise of state control over Black bodies and choices, discounting Black women's ability to make the best decisions for themselves and their families, and which is a gross violation of the core values of reproductive justice that Jennifer outlined so nicely earlier. And I'll remind everyone again that they are that everyone has and deserves the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent the children that they have in a safe and healthy environment.
Thank you so much, Alise. And kind of thinking about the reproductive justice lens in terms of its three core components, you've mentioned the kind of broad and very important implications. I'm also thinking about Anne's work being based in the South, in South Carolina, in terms of access on a geographic front. And so maybe because, Anne, you are the panelist who has a pulse of what is happening within South Carolina and throughout the South, maybe you could give us a sense of what the implications of the court's decision are on activism and advocacy happening in your state, and kind of relatedly, in the context of your work, what efforts are really being leveraged and advanced to respond, including but perhaps not limited to state-based advocacy and abortion funds.
Sure. Yes, I have been leading a state-based gender justice advocacy organization for about 7 years, and it's been tough all the way along. We've been fighting back against anti-choice legislation in the State House every single session, multiple bills, but the last week has been completely devastating. On Monday, a 6-week abortion ban went into effect in South Carolina. So at this point, abortion is illegal after around 6 weeks. That was a bill that we fought hard for several years in the State House, and that passed last year, signed into law by the governor, but was blocked by the courts until Monday. So the impact has been immediate and it has been severe. The clinics here, there were only 3 clinics, already many barriers to accessing that care, and they're turning people away. And it's a state of chaos and confusion and fear. And at the same time, the advocacy is strong and growing. We have an incredible coalition of organizations, even in a state like South Carolina, which has had historically weak infrastructure for organizing in the last few years, as these threats towards bodily autonomy, not only on access to abortion, but against LGBTQ people, against voting rights, against teaching accurate history in schools, have continued to mount. We have an incredible coalition of organizations that are coming together here in South Carolina and that are also forging alliances across state lines. And that is just a critical way forward. We have to have intersectional organizing and solidarity, and we have to have cross-movement, cross-state solidarity as well. So I have hope for that, but right now it is a bleak situation with respect to abortion access, and anti-abortion extremist legislators are ready to introduce even more extreme bans. We have a hearing next week in the State House to consider a total abortion ban.
And Anne, you've already, I think, begun to answer the question I had, but I think the touchstone of strong coalitions, organization, and organizing across geographic and movement boundaries is vital. But I'm also hearing you say that those are also incredibly, under threat at the moment. And I'm curious if you have maybe some brief things you can share with us in terms of what you're seeing in terms of ways to either stave off or think about how to organize amid these growing constraints and strictures.
Well, the only choice is for us to come together and organize. I think what is vividly clear now is that we cannot rely on the courts. We cannot rely on the legislature. We have to rely and invest in the power of people and organizations and movements. And so we need more investment in those movements. We need those to grow in strength and for there to be more ways for folks to organize and come together. Even in a small state like ours, there's an incredible amount of fragmentation. And so there's possibility there that can be fostered with more investment. I think we're seeing the outcomes of decades of underinvestment in the states and movements for feminist movements and other social justice movements here in the United States. And the way forward is to reinvigorate in those and to get as local as we can, to get down to the state and the grassroots level, because that's where we're going to need to provide care and connection as services are cut off, as our rights are constrained. We're going to have to be more and more connected at that local and grassroots level, and those networks need to expand beyond state borders.
Thank you so much, Anne and Alise, and I'm sure we'll return to both of you in the interactive part of the panel. I want to now turn to the impact on health and invite Devika and Veronica to join us in helping to sort through the broad and perhaps very immediate clinical and provider implications that you have both faced or have colleagues that are facing. And so maybe to kind of start first and foremost with your perspective, Devika, as a doctor caring for folks with high-risk pregnancies, what are the impacts that you have already seen or predict or going to see more of in supporting pregnant people in the wake of this decision?
Well, before I answer the question, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And I also want to give a shout out to Veronica, who I took chemistry classes in the Old Science Center years ago. And I thought she was amazing, hilarious, and visionary then. And my esteem and admiration for her has only increased as colleagues. So I first wanted to start off with that. Some sisterly love in all this. When I started working in Missouri, I had done my training in New York and California, and I took for granted how easy it is for women in certain communities to be able to access clinics that offer reproductive health and reproductive care and options. And as a fellow, as a high-risk pregnancy fellow, studying at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, one of the first cases I had was a mom with a lethal anomaly. And the anomaly was so bad, we couldn't really even recognize too much of the anatomy. And she, of course, was a woman of color, came from, socioeconomic circumstances that, very much disadvantaged her. And even when we were able to provide funds and monies for her to go outside of our community to be able to get, options and look at what her options are, she still was unable to, because money only goes so far when you're dealing with, very entrenched systems that are out to minoritize certain communities. Now, with the new legislation, a lot of people have been reaching out. People I haven't heard from in decades are suddenly coming out of the woodwork. And I will say that in Missouri, the reality that a lot of people fear with this new Supreme Court ruling has already been a reality for a long time. Roe as a constitutional right often felt theoretical, especially for women and women of color who are dependent on Medicaid for their pregnancy care. And I have often had to also deal with communities that have a lot of different ideologic beliefs. And so saying abortion can be a very triggering word. And I've learned to navigate that, because if they don't believe in it or believe in it, they can sometimes shut down, and my ability to be a doctor can be affected. At first, I'm not sure if it really made a difference. For some people, we've only been able to provide options if it is a medical emergency already. But what I'm understanding is that the language is very porous and that what a medical emergency is not very clear. Already in a hospital that's like a stone throw away from me that takes care of women in my community, they already had decided not to provide Plan B. And then the Attorney General just came out and said it doesn't count for Plan B at all. But fortunately, my hospital at UMKC and University Health was enlightened enough, never stopped, never wavered on that. But this is something that we have to deal with, is that increasingly, not only are women going to be targeted and women are going to have their privacy invaded, but even physicians, we might become criminals for upholding the Hippocratic Oath. We might become criminals for saving a woman or a birthing person's life. And that is a really, really tough reality to deal with.
Thank you so much. And, Veronica, I have a number of questions for you, but since you are familiar with some of our panelists, maybe you want to pick up on a thread that was just discussed in terms of concerns about criminalization among providers. And also, I think, given your extensive work in the US and abroad with a range of patients facing structural inequities and intersectional vulnerabilities, perhaps you too can speak to some of the pre-existing vulnerabilities that far precede this Supreme Court decision, but perhaps thinking about what the ramifications may be to kind of extenuate and perhaps even amplify the effects people are facing.
Yeah, thanks so much. These speakers are all so amazing and are catalyzing so many thoughts for me. I could probably go on for 4 hours, but I'll try not to. I've been chronically livid about this well before Dobbs, because especially, a lot of the problems that Devika is highlighting, and then trap laws, people don't realize how much targeted restriction on abortion providers have dramatically decreased the number of abortion clinics, especially in red states, where they put these onerous restrictions on abortion clinics and abortion providers that make it basically impossible for them to function. So in Texas, for example, they went from something like 20-something abortion clinics to 4. And Texas is a huge state. So this has been going on well before Dobbs. And Roe was essentially, non-existent or minimal for many of the people in these states. I'm really lucky to live in New York State. I'm from New York City. You can't possibly have a better environment here. I feel safe all the time. I have colleagues. I know what their thoughts are. It's not controversial. I'm always in awe of Devika and how she navigates that, because I can just spout off and I know that the person next to me probably agrees with me. And then I don't have to worry about, my safety. And I also don't have to worry about my patients. I know we can get them care. Also in New York State Medicaid covers abortion, and all pregnant women are eligible for Medicaid in New York State, regardless of immigration status. So it is possible to do the right thing. It really is. And I think New York is one of the leaders in that regard and has expanded. And my hospital, one of the public hospitals in the Bronx, has received additional funding to expand abortion services. So it is possible for governments to do this right. But what I've seen is that, number one, women have abortion everywhere. Abortion is everywhere. Making it illegal doesn't stop it from happening. It just criminalizes it and makes it unsafe, but it doesn't make it not happen. I lived in Uganda for a very long time. And women came to me for abortions. I didn't actually do them because people were doing them all over the place. Ugandan providers were doing them under the radar. They knew how to get away with it. And it was the same thing before Roe. People do them. They're not very hard, and people can get them. But the problem is that the people seeking the abortions don't know who is safe, right? And so many women can die. I was in South Sudan. People came for abortions all the time, right? And that's a really, really healthcare restrictive environment. You almost can't get healthcare. So it's everywhere. It's also in these red states. It's among the people protesting abortions. It's everywhere. And so what this is going to do, what TRAP has done and then what Dobbs has done is not reduce the number of abortions, but has made them unsafe. We also know that sometimes people can't get abortions and they may try to self-induce, especially with the availability of medical abortion. Medical abortion will make it safer. Even if people do it illegally, it is a lot safer than it was trying to do it surgically. But we don't know gestational age. We don't know if they have ectopic pregnancies that are outside the uterus, and the medical abortion isn't going to do anything about that. And if they're afraid to seek care, then they're not going to be captured in terms of their safety and appropriate management. And then I think Devika made a really important point, which is that the legal framework seems to talk about this as very black and white, right? Like either, it's an abortion or it's not. Either the mother's life is at risk or it's not. I don't really know what that means. Ever since I was a resident, I have been screaming about the fact that maternal mortality in Black women is astronomical compared to white women, compared to really everybody. There are lots of reasons. I can't get into it. That could be another webinar, but your life is at risk and it's very scary. And many of my patients are Black and they'll say to me like, I am scared that I'm not going to survive this pregnancy, just even if I do everything right. And controlling for education, controlling for income does not help that. So, what does it mean when your life is at risk? If you're 50 times more likely to die than a white woman, is that enough risk? Then you have people who break their water, rupture their membranes in second trimester. And those people right now are stable, but that pregnancy is going nowhere. It cannot survive. Does she have to be septic? Does she have to be in the ICU and dying for me to remove the pregnancy? Do we have to wait for the heartbeat to stop? Does that sound preposterous to you? It sounds preposterous to me, but it's actually a reality. A woman died in Ireland, a woman died in Poland of that exact problem. An ectopic pregnancy can implant in the tube, and it literally explodes at 7 weeks of pregnancy. It can implant somewhere in the body, and it can have a heartbeat. And so if you have a heartbeat, that pregnancy is, again, not going to survive. But many of these lawmakers and these prosecutors have no idea. I mean, many of them are clearly idiots. What do they know? They can go ahead and prosecute, right? And all of us have heard of cases of prosecutors prosecuting insane things, not even on this subject. So we as providers don't know what they're going to do. And so personally, if I was in, Kansas City or Texas or wherever, any of these states, I don't know who my local prosecutor is, and I don't know if they're an idiot. I also don't know if they're virulent, vicious, political, whatever. And at the end of the day, this is political. It's really not about health. It's really not about safety. And when this is a political issue, it's really, really dangerous because people are not listening to reason. And that really, really scares me.
Thank you. And I think that is a pivot for us to bring in some of the audience questions that I hope will bring in as many of you to answer. And I'm in real time trying to kind of cluster some of the questions, and criminalization has come up in a few different ways. So if possible, I'd like to invite Jennifer to come back since there are some questions that are specific about the criminalization of pregnant people, and accusing, this question is about women, and I would add pregnant people with stillbirths of murder. So perhaps the kind of thrust of the question is, what are some of the legal and advocacy strategies that are being explored currently to address the criminalization of pregnant and birthing people?
Thank you for that question. There are a number of states, including California, which already, our law already does not allow people to be prosecuted for the outcomes of their pregnancies, but it still happened. I think it's another example of how the law, we can't rely on the law entirely. But there are a number of other legislatures who are considering bills that would also make it explicit to protect people for the outcomes of their pregnancies, for seeking to end their pregnancies. And I think that is an important step that states can take if they want to be proactive about preventing the criminalization of their pregnancies. I also think this will require training of law enforcement, of prosecutors, people whose job it is to people in different parts of the criminal legal system all need to be on the same page once those laws are passed, because as we saw in California, It only takes one rogue prosecutor for people to spend years incarcerated. And so I think the criminal legal system is largely in the hands of states. And so this is actually an area where states can enact very meaningful change.
Thank you so much. And staying on the thread of criminalization, since a few questions have come up, I want to also bring in Anne and Alise into the discussion in terms of resources. So the question summed up is, what are some of the best resources or ways to get involved in advocacy in states where abortion is not restricted, but for folks who want to help in states where abortion is criminalized? So I think this is a kind of question about where people are located and how to best assist folks in other states where there are current or likely to be expanding restrictions.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think that's incredibly important and very much appreciated as somebody who is working in a state where abortion is criminalized and will likely soon be outright banned. The abortion funds and the advocacy networks in South Carolina and other states across the South and beyond need your support. So I encourage you all to look at those organizations. The National Network of Abortion Funds can direct you to specific abortion funds around the country. And then there are in every state, and in some state there are multiple ones, organizations like REN that are pulling together local and grassroots folks to collaborate and work together in coalition. There are many, many of them, and they are deserving of your financial support as well as your advocacy efforts and amplifying the work that they're doing to people in your networks.
Thank you so much, Anne. Alise, too, I'd love to hear from you and share some of your thoughts based in the work that you're doing at your organization.
Sure. I'd like to echo Anne's sentiments about donating to abortion funds, particularly those in the South and the Midwest. I would also add donating to your local reproductive justice organizations who've likely been doing the community grassroots building work for years in preparation for this moment, and will continue to do so as we navigate this new normal post-Roe. I'd also add to contact your local state and federal representatives and encourage them to vote for the extension of Medicaid postpartum coverage, for the Momnibus, which is a package of maternal health bills that are specifically designed to address the Black maternal health crisis. Also encourage them to vote for the removal of the Hyde and Helm amendments, which restrict or prohibit federal funding for abortion. So those are some actionable items.
Thank you both. And, you know, I want to bring in as many parts of audience questions as possible. So I do want to transition to ask and go to another constitutional question. So Carol, if you would please join us again. The question is about the possibility of essentially starting over or relitigating the right of abortion or reproductive freedom in parens based on equality or another enumerated constitutional right. So I think the question, and, you know, it's so difficult, Carol, is these are huge questions that merit really big discussions, but perhaps you might have some initial thoughts that you could share with the person who posted this question.
Right. Well, I would say that, you know, if I were queen of the world, I would not, of the US, I would not think that relitigating Roe is a good idea. And the reason is that I think the court, which is where one litigates, has come into immense disrepute, and it's unclear to me when that would be reversed or ameliorated. And so I think that the legislative approach is the better one. And it requires, you know, hard work, not only because there's such opposition to the legality of abortion, but because there's another thing we have to face, which is voter suppression. So it's one thing, this is one of the things that Justice Alito said, you know, you don't like this, go vote. What world does he live in? I mean, in states where that are removing voting days, removing early voting, requiring identifications that no one has, so that voting is terrifically important, but there's a huge impediment right now to having that substitute for litigation. It's really it's really stifling to think that there's nowhere to turn. And I think that's part of our current problem. But I would think that organizing local government is where to start. And I do think that one of the ramifications, as you've been asking everyone, of this case is the real disgrace of the judicial branch of government, which can now really be seen as wholly political. And I, as a law professor, I don't know how I'm going to teach Dobbs, because it's full of lies, it's full of misrepresentations. The different justices don't agree with each other who are on the same side. And it's this is not your grandparents' Supreme Court. We're not getting desegregation here, or welfare rights, or any of the things that some of us grew up that led us to believe the court was a necessary outlet for a majoritarian regressive government. That's not the system we're under right now. And it was wonderful to see Justice Brown sworn in today, but it was with a longing that she would have been sworn into a court that was more receptive. Roe was a 7-2 decision. That's very meaningful, because many of the justices who voted for Roe were appointed by Republicans, and they felt, and the same thing with Casey. So it was 3 Republican appointed judges who saved Casey from overturning Roe. So I think the politicization of the court is a huge factor in planning these strategies.
Thank you. And just to state perhaps the obvious, the kind of strategizing, the where to focus that strategizing, I would imagine is going to be the stuff of so much discussion and debate moving forward. Since we are about the 10-minute mark of our discussion, we will end in 5 technically, but the panelists have all generously agreed to stay over for 5 minutes. I want to bring back in Veronica and Devika to talk a little bit more about some of the questions that are coming up specific to pregnancy and medical education. So kind of also a question coming up about the ethics of teaching some of these evolving topics. So for either of you, what happens, the question is, what happens if someone is pregnant or wants to be, but has a life-threatening pregnancy and is in a state that has banned abortion with no exceptions? Do you think doctors will not save the life of the parent, even though that they have to do so as doctors given the Hippocratic Oath? And a huge question, but perhaps one of you or both of you could speak to what the medical ethical issues are in that particular question.
So in Missouri, where we do have the ban, except for medical emergency, a medical emergency is allowed. But here's again what I talked about. The language is very porous. Even our own legal advice in the hospital doesn't really know what that means. And the fear is, again, criminalization of both, you know, the birthing people, mothers, and the people who assist. And what does, you know, the problem with pregnancy is when a person shows signs, clear signs that they are potentially, you know, that their life is under threat, it is often too late. It is often, you know, the doctors are working against the clock and working against the odds. And that is why that terrible case in Ireland, you know, she by the time they recognized the signs, it was already that we were too far downstream, we're too far downstream to really save her life. And right now the legislation allows the doctors to interpret that. But the problem is that there may be legislation coming down the line, or there could be somebody who disagrees with that interpretation. And that makes us very liable. And we don't really know. It puts us in a very precarious position. Now, I think that most physicians, if somebody's life is on the line, even if it means they go to jail, is going to save that person's life, because that's the oath that we took. But it's also unfortunate that I live in a state where people are making these decisions who don't have scientific literacy, or communities that don't engage scientific literacy. And I think that's a problem that doesn't exist just in red states, but also in blue states as well.
Yeah, and to second that, I think as somebody who lives in a very blue state, I also feel the support of my colleagues, the support of my hospital and my, hospital corporation, that they would have my back. But I don't know what it's like for somebody who lives in a place where maybe their hospital leadership isn't so supportive, because it's not just the threat of criminalization, it's also affording a lawyer, and it's destroying you and your career to fight these charges, even if you are ultimately vindicated your medical license. And so I think that that's really scary. I'd like to think that everybody would be brave enough, but what we're asking people to do is absolutely preposterous, and it really shouldn't be asked. I also want to point out, these things happen all the time. It is not rare. It's not rare at all. I'm dealing with it every single day. And when we say that a woman's life is at risk, I've had plenty of patients who have serious complications in their last pregnancy, and they're at higher risk of that happening again, but we don't know. And so if they don't want the pregnancy now, and they don't want to take the risk that that'll happen again and they might die, do we terminate the pregnancy in first trimester when they're not actually sick? Or do we wait until the complication is unfolding, right? So I don't know which one of those is criminalized. I don't know if I need to wait for the person in mild heart failure to go into severe heart failure before I terminate her pregnancy. And that's not a choice that I should be forced to make, or any of us should be forced to make.
Thank you to you both. And I want to bring in, if possible, Jennifer and Alise to bring us out on one last set of questions, because I think it offers a bookend to a lot of the themes and ideas that have come up in various ways throughout our discussion today, in terms of the nexus, the intersection, the kind of overlapping implications that are about the law, but certainly far extend beyond it. And so the question is, how can the intersection between reproductive justice and other issues, for instance, increased child protective service involvement, housing instability, domestic violence, et cetera, be more amplified so that the perspective on the topic of reproductive justice is broadened? So I think the idea is kind of, how might you both or individually be thinking about the linkages between this issue and this moment as an opportunity to do some cross-movement mobilization? How might that be playing out in your work, or if you have any ideas for what a reproductive justice approach to that kind of coalitional work might look like? Huge questions, I realize. So anything you can share maybe on the front of linking this issue up to other issues, I'd love to hear what you both think.
I'm happy to go first. Yes, that is a huge question. And I think that I keep thinking about Anne's response earlier about the importance of organizing in this moment. And I think about Professor Sanger's answer previously about how voting rights will impact the success of all of these attempts to fight back against these awful decisions. And I think that what is going to be important going forward is that we don't lose hope. I think I was listening to a podcast a few days ago after the decision came out, and I think one of the things that one of the hosts said really stuck out to me, which is that the only way forward is through. And I think the worst thing that can happen now is for people who have only really come to this issue from one perspective for those folks to feel defeated. I mean, I think it is, I mean, obviously everybody feels a little defeated in this moment. How can you not feel defeated when your rights are being stripped away? But I think it's important to understand that there is a path forward. It is not immediate. Unfortunately, there are no immediate solutions, and that we have to continue to work together. We have to continue to organize. We have to recognize the ways in which things like housing, things like economic justice, things like basic healthcare all touch on abortion access. And we need to demand that our partners, that our community members, our neighbors, our lawmakers also think about things from that perspective. And we have to help them make those connections. You know, I think we have to, this is also a big thing to ask, but our media needs to make that connection too. We as individual folks only have so many platforms, soapboxes we can get on. I think it is just the long-term change that we have to embrace. And I see that Alise has unmuted herself, and I'll stop rambling now.
No worries. All of that was true. I'll just add that I think it's important to remember that our power comes from communities and movements, not courts. And you know, Black feminists have been doing and fighting, doing this work and fighting for abortion access and reproductive justice since the 90s and beyond that. And our fight will continue. And I think that the values of reproductive justice really enliven the notion that, you know, we won't all be free until the most marginalized among us are free. And I think that's how we have to start thinking about things and framing things.
Thank you so much, Alise, for that both powerful indictment about the limits of a single issue approach, but also the need for this moment to think boldly, creatively with folks most marginalized at the center of our discussion. So in the very brief amount of time we have left, I'd love to invite everybody who's joined us today to perhaps offer one or two, if you're so moved to do so, insights, whether one or two things you think people can think about or do, or if you prefer to not go there or have already articulated what you think, what's giving you hope or what's giving you energy to think about organizing that is and should continue to happen. So either a takeaway and or a hope. And I'll start with Carol. Carol, thank you. You could
Right. So I wrote a commentary for the Boston Globe this past Sunday on hope, because I asked a friend, is there anything you'd particularly like to know about Dobbs? And she said, no, I don't care about Dobbs. Can you give us a little bit of hope? And so I thought about it. And the only hope that I can see is, and it would come from generosity, is greater solidarity among women. There's not much solidarity among women even who have abortions, or not uniformly so. And so the idea that everyone has their reason and it's their good reason, and we shouldn't judge other women. So I think that might serve the basis for the beginnings of a kind of trust and solidarity among women, which I hope can veer into a political direction.
Thank you, Carol. Jennifer, over to you. I'll go in the order we presented in.
Yeah, I think what gives me hope in this moment is the fact that those of us who work on reproductive health rights and justice have been preparing for this moment. This was not a surprise for us. And I encourage folks who are searching for resources, who are searching for networks to plug into, they are out there. There's no need to feel, I know it's easy to feel like we are not really sure where to turn next, but those resources exist. People have been building them for years, for generations. And so I do encourage you to look for your local abortion fund. If you don't know where to go, look at the National Network of Abortion Funds, to look at who's organizing in your states. And those folks will be able to best direct you because they have been doing the work on the ground for a long time.
Thank you, Jennifer. Over to you, Alise.
I think my closing thoughts are, it's our duty to hold everyone accountable at every level, every day, because our lives depend on it and many people's lives depend on it. And because Roe is no longer a protection that we have. I also think that we can imagine a better world and one in which that, we don't have Roe, which is the minimum, but where we have true reproductive justice.
Thank you so much. Anne, please.
Well, one thing that gives me hope is the 800 or so people who are on this call, who are showing up to listen and learn and figure out how to engage. And my request of all of you is to stay with us. This is a long-term fight. We need you. We need each other. Please invest in the movements across this country as locally as you can. That's where the power and the possibility are. And we can nurture a really, really positive vision for change if we go local and really focus on the people who are most affected right now.
Thank you. Devika.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that, and I think this is something that a lot of people have hinted at, is that this is not just about abortion, not even just about reproductive rights. It's actually about women's rights. It's about also birthing people's rights. And when we had this recent Supreme Court ruling about the EPA, that's going to impact reproductive rights as well, or reproductive health. I'm fearful of what that means about future pregnancies that I take care of that are exposed to pollution that impacts their ability to have a healthy pregnancy. And so when I see that women's voices are in the forefront of a lot of the protests, I'm, really, really gratified. I'm really energized by that. But I also want there to be more people, generally speaking, also outraged by this, because this is going to impact our environment. It's going to impact our future world. The other thing I want to say, and as I said before, I take care of people who don't agree with what I believe in, and who don't believe in abortion, partly because they live in a community where they vote on that alone. There's a huge social structure that is just on that. And even when they start thinking about it and even get one, they sometimes find it very hard to get on board because of those social structures. But one thing that all my patients can agree on, and I tell them this, is that unfortunately, and this may not be a note of hope, I think we do live in a society that is very hostile to women and birthing people. And they know that in the way that everybody has to negotiate with their employer to be able to accommodate certain things about their pregnancy, the way they can't afford childcare, the way that they often feel that because they were forced to have a pregnancy that was complicated by a birth defect, their marriage fell apart and they're not together. And they honestly believe, this happened actually with a rideshare driver in Kansas City, told me that he believes he would still be married to his wife if they weren't, their marriage wasn't affected by that pregnancy. And so I just really want people to understand is that we do have an uphill battle, but I think the best way to battle it is to understand we are in it together, and that includes people who don't agree with us. And we have to be able to accommodate those conversations, because when we do, we realize we might have more in common with them than we realize.
Thank you so much, Devika, for that really thoughtful reflection and way to kind of close out. But Veronica and Gas, perhaps you could share some thoughts/hope for us to round out our discussion.
Yeah, I think people are providing contacts for great abortion access funds, which is really important. But one point I want to make is that what Dobbs did is that it said that on the federal level, we can't say that states can't ban abortion. So states can choose to ban abortion. So this is now on the state front until we can do something nationally again. And so I do want people to think about donating on a state level. If I can put in a personal plug for a high school and college, Wellesley friend of mine, who's an amazing state senator in Georgia, an anesthesiologist and pro-choice legislator, first Asian American to represent her district, is now running for the House because the GOP gerrymandered her out of her seat. But it's really important for us to support, Michelle Au is her name. She is, it's important for us to support candidates like that because they're going to be making the decisions in their state and voting on this and weighing in on these restrictions. And she's been doing really great work. So if you want to support a Wellesley grad who's running, well, Michelle Au, AU, but in different state races where this is really important, we can do this. And I think Stacey Abrams showed us that states we had written off before can actually be purple. And so I'm planning to look into local state races and see who I can support so that they can continue the fight in more difficult states.
Thank you all so much. And as came through very clearly in the comments, there were a number of comments and questions about what's next steps. Hopefully from the collective responses of our participants, you have gotten a working sense of that. But as I said in my opening, this is the beginning, not the kind of totalizing conversation. So it's my hope that there will be a lot more robust, engaged, student-led, faculty, staff, engaged conversations at Wellesley and beyond in the coming months. So thank you for your willingness to stay on a bit over time. Thanks also so much to each of the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your brilliance and expertise with us. I'm super grateful that you're all with us and sharing what you know. And for participants who are listening in, thank you for being here. I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your night and have a great day. Bye-bye.